You're listening to The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher, the program that asks the question, what is God doing in Israel and the wider Middle East in these days? To answer that question, each week we hear from believers who live there and listen as they share their stories. Recently, we've featured missionaries from the global organisation Jews for Jesus. Now we focus on their work in Israel, where Eli Birnbaum is the director. So let's start by hearing a little about his background and how he comes to be doing what he's doing.
I was born in the States, in New York. I know we have some British listeners here, but my parents moved to Israel when I was 7 years old, and that's where I grew up. I grew up just outside of Tel Aviv.
So why did they move to Israel? What was the motivation?
My dad came to faith. He was born in Brooklyn, New York. He came to faith in the 70s, and it was on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, that he prayed in the back of his Volkswagen van to accept Jesus into his heart. And he walked into a church, and that's where he began worshiping, and then eventually felt the call to be led into ministry. And he met my mother there. But it was around 1988 and 1987 where he felt the call back to the Jewish people, where he really felt that God was calling him to minister to his own people. And he started a Messianic congregation in Albany, New York. And but the moment he started that congregation, he knew that the end journey was back in Israel. That was the land where God had called him back to his people. And so packed up, we were 5 kids, packed up our suitcases, our house, and moved to a city just outside of Bat Yam. And I was 7 years old, in the middle of the family. We had a newborn and a 4-year-old and 2 older sisters.
Wow, that sounds quite chaotic.
It was, and the suitcases, and you were allowed to check in 2 suitcases at that time, if any of you remember. So every kid had 2 suitcases checked in for them.
My goodness!
So that was the travel. Yeah.
And so, what did your father do when he came to Israel?
Well, my dad, he just felt to move here. He wasn't looking to be in ministry or anything like that. He got a job selling packages for tours coming to Israel, and then he was a copier salesman for a long time. And that's just kind of what he did for the first 10 years of being in Israel. And later he decided to plant a small congregation in our city of Bat Yam, and he's been doing that since. He's 70 years old today, or 71.
And what were your memories as a 7-year-old coming to Israel and having to go to school and presumably learn to speak Hebrew fluently?
Right. So that was a huge challenge, a huge thing. When you're small, my dad had been to Israel. I was 91 when we moved, and he had been there in 1990. And I, as a 6-year-old, all I saw was a picture of him riding a camel. So I immediately assumed that, that's how things go in Israel. So I thought I'd come to Israel and I'd be taking a camel to school. And that's kind of how, that's what I remember. I was very surprised to get here and see a very modern country. But learning Hebrew was a big challenge. As a young kid, I learned how to read very fast and was a very good reader already in first grade or second grade when I arrived. And it was this big challenge to now relearn everything, not only how to speak, to read and write. And I think that took me like a year or 2 years to kind of get grips of that. But by 5th grade, I was a good student again. So that's really what happened.
So as you finished your time at school, and presumably you then went into the army, what were your plans for your life? What did you see yourself doing in the future?
Well, as you grow up as a Jewish believer in Israel, you're told this subtle, at least back then, hopefully now, I have kids myself, I definitely do not teach them this, but subtly you're told to keep your faith quiet. So as growing up, that was always a struggle of how do I maintain myself? How do I bring my identity out to school? And especially when you're in high school, when you're trying to find your identity. And so it was a big challenge for me because no one really knew that I was a follower of Jesus, yet this was a big part of my identity. And it was towards the end of high school that I made a decision that everyone will know that I follow Jesus. And that's what I did. And at the end of a school year, I got up in front of my class. It was actually an English class, like they were teaching English as a second language. And I gave a lecture about my faith in Jesus. And that was really, for me, a commitment that I would never hide my faith again. And that's something that I continued to do throughout the army. And eventually, when I got into ministry, that was something that I felt is very important to bring to the next generation of Jewish believers in Israel. Faith is not something we should hide. It's a big part of our identity. And so now to answer your actual question, what I thought, I don't know. I wasn't sure from a young age, really, when I was actually in England when I was 16 years old, where I felt a call from God to serve, to minister. But I didn't know how that would look like, what exactly that would look like. I do know now what it would look like, but back then I didn't know what it would look like. And I was also interested in business. And so that was something that I thought about. And I eventually did a degree in economics as my undergraduate. Or how do you say it in England? Is you don't call it undergraduate, right? It's
we
undergraduate.
yeah, that's fine. Yeah, we use that.
Because in Israel we say we use the first degree is how we call it.
No, we would say undergraduates. No, you're quite
Okay.
right there. Yeah.
So very good.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was in economics, and I just finished my graduate, as you say, in biblical and theological studies from Western Seminary.
So really, then you were destined to be involved in mission, and so Jews for Jesus for you was a natural step forward, was it?
I don't think anyone getting a call to an industry feels like it was the natural step. So I would, but no. So when I was from a young age, I was serving in my youth group, and in Tel Aviv area, Jews for Jesus was at that time really one of the only ministries. So I was always aware, and I had good friends who were part of the ministry, and I really felt called to serve in youth ministry, and I tried that for a while. I went to the States for a while, but after that time, I would say I wasn't sure really if this was my calling, and I decided to go into business, and I helped start a real estate company. And during that time, I would meet the then director of Jews for Jesus, Dan Sarad, and we would go look for a ministry center in Tel Aviv. And that was kind of something I would see him every few months, and we'd kind of look at these properties. And then it was in 2009 when our company closed. They offered me to start an internship with Jews for Jesus, and it just really, really made sense. And one of the things that they asked me to help do was to find our ministry center in Israel, which was the Moish Rosen Center, which we purchased in 2010, and I established it and the work there, and it continues to this day. Right now, my wife is actually the director of that facility and that ministry as we use it to minister to the neighborhood.
Now, Eli, you mentioned your wife. So at what point in your life did your wife appear?
So my wife appeared out of nowhere from Mexico City on a Jews for Jesus mission trip called Masa, which is our backpackers outreach. And she came for the version that most of the participants come from North America. And so she came on that trip, and she came to Israel. I was helping lead the project that year. We traveled to India together. Nothing happened during the trip, but we did start talking, and that year I was leading the first trip Israeli backpackers to Peru, and I decided that my wife was worth visiting and to take an extra week to go to Mexico from Peru. and that's where it all started.
That's where the story started. So
Hmm.
here you are now, married with your own family and well entrenched in the Jews for Jesus work in Israel. Now, Ellie, as you mentioned, you've had a long association with them through your business, and now here you are, director of the Israel team. You're based in Tel Aviv. Just a little word about that city. Describe it to our
Right.
listeners.
Yeah, so Tel Aviv is kind of what you would expect from any metropolis city around the world, and yet more. I mean, it's I'm looking out on my office window right now, and there's skyscrapers everywhere. There's lots of traffic, lots of activities, and so it's actually smaller than most big cities, but it still has that vibe because there's so many. There's about 6 or 7 surrounding cities that are quite large around it, and so it has that big city atmosphere. Everyone comes here and does that. And this is where culture is made. This is where business is made. Most of the embassies are here. All the banks' headquarters are here. There's a big amount of vast tech companies that are have their quarters here, all the artists, and this is just really the nucleus of the modern Israeli culture is coming from and out of Tel Aviv.
And it's a very secular city on the one hand, but yet it's got a lot of religious people there as well.
Yeah, I mean, so Tel Aviv itself does not have too many religious people, but it definitely has probably more per numbers than you'd say in London because there's a lot of religious people here. But right next to Tel Aviv, there's a religious city of about 100, 150,000 that has only religious people, and that's right by us. But the rest of city, the understanding of it is it's a very secular city. People don't keep any faith. They don't visit the synagogue, not even once a year. And they're I wouldn't say everyone's atheists, but they are definitely agnostic about God and religious stuff.
You've been listening to Eli Birnbaum, Director of Jews for Jesus in Israel, and we'll hear more from him on next week's programme. The Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund is a Christian charity based in the UK that supports the needs of both Jewish believers and Arab or Palestinian Christians living in Israel and the wider Middle East. If you'd like to know more about our work and receive our free bi-monthly newsletter, please visit our website, olivetreefund.org. Meanwhile, join me at the same time next week for another story from the Olive Tree. Until then, goodbye.